Language. We used it constantly. I'm using it right now. We use thousands of words a day, and most of the time we're doing it without thinking about it at all. But here's the thing, language is not a neutral tool. It's not just a vehicle that carries meaning from your mind to somebody else. It does something, it constructs reality, it shapes how we see the world, who we include, who we leave out, and what we think is normal. So that's what this presentation is about, not grammar, not vocabulary, but the power of language and the ways it can go sideways on us without us even noticing. Here's the foundational idea. Words do not have meaning, people do. And this is called the triangle of meaning, or sometimes the semantic triangle. And it comes from two linguists named Ogden and Richards who published it way back in 1923. And the idea is this: there's a symbol, the word, a referent, the actual thing in the world that it refers to, and a thought, the concept in your head. And the connection between those three things is not direct, it's not automatic, it's constructed, which is why the word cat means something completely different to the person who grew up with three Siamese than it does to the person who was scratched or bitten by a cat when they were a young child. Same word, completely different mental content. And this is the difference between denotative and connotative meaning. Denotative is the dictionary definition, the official, the agreed upon reference. But connotative is all the associations and feelings and the baggage that comes with the word depending on who's using it and who's hearing it. Take the word home. Denotative, the place where you live. Connotative, totally different depending on your experience. For some people, home means safety, and for others, it means complicated feelings about family. For someone who's experienced housing instability, it might mean something completely different from that. And that's why so much communication can break down. And not because people aren't smart or they're not trying, but because we assume our connotations are shared and they're often not. Here's something super wild. You know thousands of rules about language that nobody ever even explicitly taught you. You didn't sit down one day and learn that the big red barn sounds right and the red big barn sounds wrong. You didn't study why I'm going to the store. It's a complete thought. And going the store to is chaos. You just know because you absorb the rules of your language through immersion starting before you could walk. And linguists organize these rules into four categories. The first one is phonological rules, and those govern sound, which sounds exist in a language, how they're combined to make meanings. English does not use every possible human sound. There are clicks used in Xhosa and Zulu that English speakers can't even reliably produce because our phonological system never developed those pathways. And within English, we have rules about which sounds can go where. Str can start a word, sl cannot. And you know this without knowing you know it. Syntactic rules govern structure, word order, grammar, how sentences are assembled. So English is relatively rigid about word order compared to languages like Latin, where you can move words around freely because the endings tell you the grammatical role. In English, the dog bit the man and the man bit the dog are very different situations. Syntax is doing the work. But here's the thing, we can understand words out of syntactic order when we've been exposed to a consistent alternative pattern long enough to internalize it. At me, bro, you come is wrong by every rule of English syntax, and you understood it instantly because you've seen enough Yoda to build a second grammar. And that's how powerful syntactic pattern recognition is. Give your brain enough repetitions of a rule system and it will learn it, even a fictional one. Semantic rules, those govern meaning. what words refer to, how meaning is assigned, how changes in wording shift interpretation. This is the layer closest to what we talked about with denotation and connotation. So, semantic rules are also where we get into the slipperiest territory because meaning is the most socially negotiated of the four. Words change meaning over time. Think about slang that becomes part of our lexicon. New meanings emerge, old ones fade, and this is called semantic change or semantic drift. And it happens constantly. Quick example here, awful used to mean inspiring awe, full of awe. Terrific used to mean terrifying. And nice comes from the Latin meaning ignorant. You wouldn't want to call somebody that now. So these words drifted so far from their origins that we'd never guess, and that drift is semantic change in action. Pragmatic rules govern use in context, so the social, situational layer of language. Same sentence, completely different meaning depending on who's saying it, to whom, and when. Can you pass the salt? Is technically a question about your physical capability, which is why people joke, yes, I can. But pragmatically, everyone knows it's a request. Can you please pass the salt? Please pass the salt. Nice job, said sincerely versus said with a specific tone. Nice job is the same two words doing completely different communicative work. And pragmatics is also where we find the gap between what is said and what is meant, which is where a lot of the interesting and frustrating communication happens. Language has three properties that make it both incredibly useful and constantly unreliable. First, it's arbitrary. The word tree does not look like a tree or sound like a tree or smell like a tree. And the connection between the sound we make and the thing we're referring to is completely made up. Different languages picked completely different sounds for the same object, and they all work equally well. Arbitrary doesn't mean meaningless, it means the connection is based on social agreement, not logic. We all agreed on this, and so it works. Second, it's ambiguous. Words have multiple meanings depending on context. The word fine can mean wonderful, acceptable, barely tolerable, or a monetary penalty. And the only way to know which one is context. Think about how often people say, I'm fine, and mean entirely different things. This is why context is everything in communication. And third, it's abstract. Language operates on a spectrum from concrete to abstract, which linguist S.I. Hayakawa described as the abstraction ladder. At the bottom, very concrete, specific reference. So, my copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. As you go up the ladder, you get more abstract. To Kill a Mockingbird, Pulitzer Prize winning novels, books, publications, information. The higher you go, the more people can agree on the word while meaning completely different things. Politicians are masterful at this, by the way. We support freedom. Every single person hearing that thinks, yes, me too. But what does freedom mean? They might be talking about wildly different things. High abstraction creates the illusion of agreement. Keep that in mind anytime you're analyzing a speech. There's a specific kind of ambiguity that trips people up constantly, and it has a name, relative language. These are words that only have meaning in relation to something else. They require a reference point that the speaker assumes you share, but often you don't. So words like some, a little, soon, nearby, hot, a lot, just a dash, really old, short. None of these mean anything without context. And here's the problem for people who think concretely, who want a number, a measurement, a specific thing they can verify, relative language isn't just vague, it's a wall. And I learned this from an experience with my mom. She was teaching me to cook when I was young, and I was trying to follow along doing exactly what she said. Just add some. Some what? Some how much? I had no reference point. I was guessing. I got it wrong. I guessed again. I got it wrong again. And somewhere in that process, I stopped wanting to cook at all. Not because cooking is so hard, but because the instructions assumed I already knew what some meant in that kitchen, in that dish, in her hands, after her 30 years of making it. And that is what relative language does when the reference point isn't shared. It feels like you're failing at something that the other person finds obvious. And that experience of feeling incompetent in the face of vague instructions is communication failure, not personal failure. So think about how often we do this in everyday life. Be back soon. It's not that far. Just clean it up a little. Just add enough so it tastes right. So these phrases work perfectly between people who share the same frame of reference. They can be genuinely alienating to anyone who doesn't. And this matters in professional contexts too, in workplaces, in classrooms, and in healthcare. Take this medication with a small amount of food. How small? We need this done relatively quickly. By when exactly? So, relative language protects the speaker from being pinned down, but it puts all the burden of interpretation on the listener. And the fix isn't to eliminate relative language. That's impossible. And honestly, some situations call for flexibility. The fix is awareness and anchoring when precision matters. Be precise. And if you're on the receiving end of just add some, it's completely reasonable to say, how much is some? Here is where it gets really interesting. In the 1930s, there was a linguist named Benjamin Whorf, and he was working on ideas developed with a partner, Edward Sapir. And they proposed something radical, that language doesn't just express thought, it shapes thought. The strong version of this is called linguistic determinism, and the language you're speaking determines what you're able to think. Isn't that crazy? And that version has mostly been discredited. The evidence doesn't support the idea that language fully locks us out of certain concepts. But the weaker version of that, linguistic relativity, has a lot of support. The idea is that language influences how we perceive and how we categorize the world. It's not a prison, but a lens. So we're not in jail, but we're looking through our language. And here's a super cool example. Russian speakers have two completely separate words for light blue and dark blue, голубой and синий. Where English just says blue and they add dark or light, but they just say blue. And research by Jonathan Winnower and colleagues found that Russian speakers are actually faster at distinguishing between shades of blue that cross that linguistic boundary than, say, English speakers would be. The language they grew up with literally trained their perception. Or consider this: English has one word for the past. The past. The Aymara people of the Andes conceptualize time in a way that's spatially inverted from how English speakers do. And they associate the past with the space in front of you because you can see it, you know it, and the future behind you because you can't see it. So their language reflects that, and their gestures reflect that, and their spatial orientation toward time is fundamentally different. So, language is not just how we describe reality, it participates in building it. Words can do serious work in the world. So, let's talk about a few specific ways. Naming and labeling are powerful because they confer reality. If there's a word for something, it exists in a way it didn't before. And there's a reason that activists fight so hard over terminology, whether we're going to call it undocumented immigrant or illegal alien, whether we're going to say pro life or anti abortion, whether we're going to say collateral damage or civilian deaths. These are not just stylistic choices. Each framing activates different associations and different emotional responses and different policies. And this is what communication scholars call framing, the way language directs attention toward certain aspects of an issue and away from others. And then there's the concept of loaded language, words with strong emotional charge built in. So the difference between describing someone as assertive versus aggressive, thin versus gaunt, passionate versus volatile. Often the factual referent is the same, but what's different is the evaluation that's just baked into the word choice. And here's one that's often underestimated: the power of names. Your name is one of the first and most consistent language tools used to construct your identity. Research consistently shows that people whose names are easily pronounced by those in power are treated differently in hiring and in school and in healthcare. That is not a character flaw in the individuals, that is language doing power. The words that we choose signal status, and they do it in ways we probably don't even notice. So, powerful language that's direct and confident and unhedged, and it's going to make claims. It's going to say, this is the right approach. We need to change this. I disagree. So, this language does not apologize for existing. Powerless language is loaded with hedges and qualifiers and disclaimers. So, you might say, I might be wrong, but, or this is probably a dumb idea, but, or sorry, can I maybe just. So, research by Lakoff and other scholars consistently shows that speakers who use more powerless language are rated as less credible, less confident, less persuasive, even when the content of what they're saying is identical to the powerful language users. And here's the uncomfortable part: powerless language patterns are not randomly distributed. They correlate with gender socialization, with personal anxiety, with cultures that value deference, and with people who've been trained explicitly or implicitly that taking up space is not for them. So when we talk about powerful versus powerless language, we're not just talking about communication strategy. We're talking about who gets taken seriously and why. And worth noting, there's a difference between powerless language and appropriate tentativeness. Always being right is not the thing we're looking for here. So if you say, I'm not certain, but the data suggests, that's not powerless. It's epistemically honest. The problem is the reflexive self undermining that happens before we've even made our point. And then there's affiliative versus divergent language, which is about whether your language pulls people together or pushes them apart. So, affiliative language emphasizes connection, the we, the shared experience, the common ground, that kind of acknowledgement. Divergent language emphasizes difference, I over we, and distancing and marking yourself as separate from a group. Neither of these is inherently good or bad. Divergent language is sometimes exactly right when you need to set a boundary, when you need to own a position, or not get swept up in groupthink. But in ongoing relationships, a consistent pattern of divergent language reads as disengagement, and in conflict, affiliative language, we're trying to solve the same problem here, can completely change the temperature of a conversation. Language is not just descriptive, it's normative. It tells us what counts as default, what counts as other, what gets a word and what doesn't. So, for a long time, English defaulted to masculine pronouns generically, he as the standard human being. The argument was purely grammatical, but the psychological effect was real. Studies going back to the 1970s show that generic masculine pronouns cause people to picture men even when the context is intended to be neutral. So, language that erases half the population is not neutral, it's doing something. The shift toward the singular they, which sounds grammatically new, but is actually documented in English as far back as Shakespeare, is one example of language evolving to be more inclusive. So, this isn't just about politeness, it's about whose existence is acknowledged as real and normal. And this connects to a broader concept: linguistic privilege. The closer our natural language patterns are to what's considered standard or educated, the less we have to explain ourselves and code switch and prove our competence. Language norms are often tied to perceptions of race and class and region, and judging people's intelligence based on accent or dialect is a form of discrimination that tends to fly under their radar because it gets coded as just grammar. We need to spend a minute on misunderstandings because they're not random. They follow predictable patterns. Bypassing is when two people use the same word to mean different things or different words to mean the same thing without realizing it. So, classic example, can you help me with this? Sure. And then one person thought that meant right now, and the other meant sometime this week. Same words, completely different interpretations. No conflict until the deadline arrives. Euphemism is when we replace a direct word with something softer, more palatable, often for good reasons, sometimes to obscure reality. So, passed away instead of died is a compassion driven euphemism. Enhanced interrogation instead of torture is a power driven one. So, knowing the difference, that matters. Jargon and equivocal language. So, every field develops its own vocabulary. This creates efficient communication inside a group, perfect confusion outside it. So, when a doctor says the prognosis is guarded, a patient might hear, I'll probably be okay. And the doctor means, I don't know. And that's worrying. And finally, abstraction overload, when we stay so high on that ladder I mentioned earlier that we can't get traction. We need better communication. Okay, what does that mean? What specifically should change? The higher the abstraction, the harder the action. So these three are subtle. They don't feel like distortions when you're using them, and that's what makes them worth knowing. Fact, inference, confusion is when we state an inference as though it's a fact and we don't even realize we've done it. A fact is something directly observable and verifiable. An inference is a conclusion drawn from observation. Both are useful. The problem is when we blur the line. So, she ignored me in the hallway. Is that a fact? You observe that she didn't make eye contact or speak to you. The inference is that she ignored you and that it was intentional, and that it was about you. Well, maybe it was, but maybe she was running through a presentation in her head and genuinely didn't see you. Stating the inference as fact closes off any other possibilities before you've even investigated. And this one causes a staggering amount of unnecessary conflict. He doesn't respect me. She's out to get me. They don't care. Those are all inferences wearing fact clothing. Equivocal language is language with more than one plausible interpretation, and the speaker often knows it. It's the art of technically not lying while also not being clear. I'll look into it. We're considering all options. That's an interesting perspective. Politicians are fluent in equivocal language, and so are people who don't want to have a hard conversation. The problem is that the listener often picks the most optimistic interpretation and then feels deceived when reality lands differently. And finally, emotive language, words that smuggle an evaluation inside a description. So the choice between slim and scrawny, statesman and politician, freedom fighter and terrorists. These pairs often describe the same referent, but what's different is the attitude baked into the word. Emotive language isn't always manipulative. We can't drain all evaluation out of language, and we wouldn't want to. But recognizing when a word is doing evaluative work disguised as descriptive work is a critical thinking skill. So, what do we do with all of this? Well, a few things. First, we want to slow down before we assume. When communication goes wrong, resist the instinct to assume bad intent. A lot of misunderstandings are semantic, they're not personal. Ask clarifying questions. So when you said X, what did you mean by that? Is one of the most powerful communication moves we have. Second, pay attention to the words we reach for automatically. Language is habit. We default to words we've absorbed from our environment, and those habits carry assumptions we may have consciously endorsed. Noticing our language is a form of noticing our thinking. And third, understand that just words, that's not a thing. Words don't stay in the air, they land on people. They shape what's possible in a conversation. They open doors, they close them. Treating language as a precise and powerful tool is a communication skill. It's not a political agenda. So consider paying attention this week to the words people choose and what those choices reveal. Thanks for being here and talking about language. Have a great day.